Hello, friends. So, in this video, I want to talk about the Gospel of John, chapter 11, verses 1 through 45, which is the Gospel reading for the fifth Sunday of Lent, um, in year A of the lectionary. Once again, we have a really long story here, and so I didn't try and put all the text on the screen, and I'm also not going to try to walk through the story verse by verse, as I've done with some other passages. So I'd encourage you to go ahead and read the whole story of John 11, 1 through 45, if you haven't done that already, before you watch that video. Instead, I've organized a number of the verses sort of thematically throughout the story to highlight for us some of what I think is going on in the story, and what are some major preaching and teaching points that we can make from this story. So, of course, John 11 is the well-known story of Lazarus being sick and dying, and then Jesus raising him from the dead. But I want to note right at the very beginning of the story that there's already a sense in which the way this story is set up from its very opening verses to foreshadow Jesus' death. And the reason for that, or the reason I would say it's foreshadowing Jesus' death, is that it says right from the beginning that Lazarus was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. And then we get this parenthetical statement, this was the Mary who anointed the Lord with fragrant oil and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was ill. Well, that's interesting because this story about Mary anointing Jesus' feet with oil hasn't been told yet in the Gospel of John, right? At least for me, with this sort of parenthetical statement, if you're saying like, "Hey, this is the person who is related to this person, who did this thing," you would think you would have heard the story of that thing already, right? Of what this person did. But this story actually isn't told until the next chapter. Now, some commentators will point to this as sort of layers to the composition of the Gospel of John, that maybe the Gospel of John wasn't written all at once, that certain parts of it were written, and then that other pieces were added in layer, and that may very well be the case. I'm not looking to dispute that. But even if we take the Gospel of John in this final form that we know it as it stands, I think it's an interesting foreshadowing to what's about to come in the next chapter. And I actually think we'll find there's a number of ways in which chapter 11 and 12 are really kind of tied closely together. Because, of course, Mary doing that in the larger story of the Gospel of John, Mary anointing Jesus in chapter 12 is a sort of preparation for his burial. Um, and so there's a sense in which we've got the story about Lazarus who is sick and dying, and of course, we've heard the story before, so we know that Jesus is going to bring him back to life. But even in the story about life, there's kind of this foreshadowing of Jesus' own death. And even if we skip down to verse 16, I mean, this statement is just incredible. I find it remarkable that when Jesus is saying, okay, well, so let's go to Judea, and the disciples say, Rabbi, the Jewish opposition wants to stone you, but you want to go back there? And Jesus basically says, yeah, I mean, he says this sort of cryptic thing about there's 12 hours in the day, and whoever walks in the day doesn't stumble because they see the light of the world. But basically, he says, yes, like we're going to go to Judea. And then Thomas remarkably says to the other disciples, let us go too, so that we may die with Jesus. Um, which is just a remarkable statement on a number of levels. One, just obviously, simply, it's kind of courageous, right, that he's willing to go die with Jesus. But I think also because so often in the Gospels, the disciples don't understand Jesus' mission. Perhaps more in the Synoptics than in John, but in any case, the disciples are often just sort of out of the loop on Jesus reminding them again and again that his mission has to include the cross. So it's remarkable in that sense that Thomas is just like, okay, let's go die with Jesus. Um, and then maybe also remarkable that it's Thomas, right, who perhaps unfortunately has gotten the moniker of doubting Thomas, which is maybe a little unfair to him. But I mean, he's showing remarkable courage and bravery in this particular instance when he says, let us go too, so that we may die with Jesus. In any case, there are these little elements at the very beginning, and then verse 16, still pretty near the beginning of the story, that are pointing us towards Jesus's death, even as this is a story about resurrection life. So just sort of tuck that in the back of your mind for a second, and we'll kind of come back around to that at the end because I think that's really important. Um, there's also this sort of narrative device in the story that kind of creates tension with the story, where Jesus is in no hurry, right? So I titled this "Jesus patiently waits for God's glory." I thought of just titling it "Jesus is in no hurry" in this story, right? So Jesus says in verse 4 to the disciples, "This illness," talking about Lazarus, "isn't fatal. It's for the glory of God, so that God's Son can be glorified through it." Um, but then we hear that, and well, let me back up. So, I mean, I think this is a sort of thematic statement in many ways of this story, is that the purpose, not unlike the story in John 9 of the man born blind, where the story begins by the disciples asking, who sinned, this man or his parents? And Jesus' response is neither. It's not about that. It's about the glory of God being manifested in him. And so it's a very similar thing in this story that he's saying, the purpose of Lazarus's death is not that he's going to die, although he does die, at least temporarily, um, but it's so that God's glory might be seen. And this really runs throughout this whole narrative. I mean, you can see the verses I've listed in this box really run through the whole story. That there's a sense in which at no point in this story is Jesus in any hurry. And in fact, he sort of deliberately delays almost. And I think it's because of what he says here in verse 4, right? That the purpose of this whole thing is for God to be glorified. The characters in the story all want Jesus to hurry up, right? I sort of think of it, it's somewhat akin to like if you're watching a movie and you as the audience, you know something and the character in the story doesn't know, and it's sort of like, hey, you need to get to this place to save this person, right? Well, that's kind of how it's a little bit sort of switching of uh, placement of characters in a sense, but that's sort of how the other characters in the story are responding to Jesus, right? Jesus has taken his sweet time. When he heard, in verse 6, when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed where he was. And then after 2 days, he left. So he's not in any hurry to get there. And then when Jesus does finally arrive, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. And there's sort of a fun little thing. If you read this passage in the KJV, it's sort of a little fun thing because they say to him, Lord, by this time he stinketh, which is just kind of a fun translation. But anyway, so he's been in the tomb 4 days when he arrives. And then we get the piece where it's like, yeah, the characters in the story are like, Jesus, if only you had hurried, right? And so much so that the same conversation basically gets repeated between Martha and Mary, right? That Martha meets Jesus first and says, Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. And then they have this whole conversation, which we're going to go to in just a second. And then he meets Mary. And when Mary arrived where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, hey, oh, this sounds familiar. Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died, right? And then Jesus began to cry. So even, I mean, there's lots we can talk about here about this verse. Jesus wept. The CEV takes it as Jesus began to cry. The shortest verse in the Bible, but also one of the most powerful, right? In the fact that we see that Jesus can express his grief at this loss of his friend, even as he knows what's about to happen, that he's about to raise him up again. Um, but I think we can put this sort of, while there's a lot to be said about that verse by itself, and it's important that Jesus takes the time to weep and mourn, I think we can also put it in this larger category of Jesus is still taking his time, right? Even once Lazarus is dead, he takes the time to weep and mourn the loss of his friend, even as he knows that he's about to raise him up. And then the Jews who are present said, see how much he loved him. But some of them said, he healed the eyes of the man born blind, going back to that story we heard in chapter 9. Couldn't he have kept Lazarus from dying? right? So there's just this emphasis of this narrative device over and over again, that if only Jesus would hurry up a little bit, that then things would have been okay. And so, of course, the implication is that they're not okay because he didn't hurry up, right? Uh, that actually, I think, is an important component of the story that I want to kind of tie all these threads together at the end. So, but that patience, I think, is important for ways we might think about the relevance of this passage for us today. But for now, I just want to say it also sort of propels us into this other point that I want to make, that once again we have more two-leveled conversations in the Gospel of John, right? I've talked about this in several videos at this point, that in the Gospel of John, the conversations Jesus has with the characters in the Gospel of John are almost always happening on two different levels, and that the characters in the story are often hearing Jesus on a plain, literal, physical level, and Jesus is speaking on a higher spiritual plane and trying to point them towards that higher spiritual reality, and they always fail to get it at first, and then Jesus restates it in a way that they can understand. And so this conversation with Martha, where she first says, "Lord, if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died," propels us then into the two-leveled conversation um, of John 11. Oh, although I should back up a little bit. I forgot that there's already one that happens earlier in the story when in verses 11 to 14, when Jesus has said, "Oh, our friend Lazarus is sleeping, but I'm going in order to wake him up." The disciples said, "Lord, if he's sleeping, he will get well." They thought Jesus meant that Lazarus was in a deep sleep, but Jesus had spoken about Lazarus' death. Jesus told them plainly, "Lazarus has died. For your sakes, I'm glad I wasn't there so that you can believe. Let's go to him." So kind of a little mini two-leveled conversation. I don't think there's like super deep significance to this one because it's just he's using the metaphor of sleep for death, and then he has to explain to them, no, actually Lazarus is dead. Although what he says here, "For your sakes, I'm glad I wasn't there so that you can believe," ties back into this theme of Jesus taking his time for the specific purpose of God's glory being manifested, right? But this going back now to this conversation with Martha, that actually propels us down here into this conversation. So Martha says to Jesus in verse 21, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died." And Jesus responds to her, "Your brother will rise again." And Martha replied, "I know that he will rise in the resurrection on the last day," right? So here in verse 24, uh, Martha is stating a very typical first century Jewish belief, right? That at the end of time there will be a resurrection of the dead, that everybody will be resurrected to judgment and or reward. Um, and so Martha's saying, "Yeah, I know he'll be resurrected." And Jesus says, Jesus corrects her essentially. So we have that same thing of like Martha is understanding him, what he's saying on a particular plane, and Jesus saying, "No, no, actually," he says, "I am the resurrection and the life." Another one of the "I am" statements in the Gospel of John, which we have several of. "I am the resurrection of the life. Whoever believes in me will live, even though they die. Everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" And so once again, we have this two-leveled conversation, um, in which Jesus is directing Martha to this sort of higher spiritual plane of saying, no, no, it's not just that he'll be resurrected someday. It's that I, Jesus, am the resurrection, and you need to believe in me as the one who has resurrection power, right? This miracle that Jesus does in chapter 11 is important then in the overall scope of the Gospel of John. Scholars, commentators will often refer to the book of signs. I've noted here that it's 7 signs, and of course the number 7 is an important number in the Bible, often representing perfection, completion, things like that. And so scholars will often talk about this book of signs in John, that you have Jesus performs these 7 miracles, all of which are meant to promote belief in him as the Messiah, as the Son of God. And you'll see here that raising Lazarus from the dead, what we get here in chapter 11, is the final one of those seven signs. So that's kind of significant in of itself, and of course that makes sense, right? Because he's raising somebody from the dead. It's really more significant than all these other signs. I mean, not to put these other miracles down, they're pretty remarkable, right? But you would say that like probably bringing somebody back to life is kind of the ultimate miracle. It is the ultimate sign of Jesus himself as the resurrection of the life. And so it's fitting that it is the final sign um, in the book of John, and is really, well, I think it's doing two things, and this, I think, starts to get to the main point that I want to make about this passage. On the one hand, it's pointing towards what will really kind of be the final. I mean, this is the final of the seven, but in some ways we get a bonus sign, so to speak, that really the final sign of the gospel is Jesus' own resurrection. And I think the symbolism of that being the eighth sign is really significant, right? Because there is a sense in which these seven signs are complete and perfect on their own, and yet this eighth sign of Jesus' own resurrection is starting something new, right? You could see this as these seven signs represent the a completion of a week, and so then the eighth sign is a new week or a new creation, right? So there's a sense in which Jesus' resurrection now has it's not just that he's doing these signs within the old creation to point us to who he is, but his resurrection has now started a new week, a new creation, a new completion and perfection. And so there's one sense in which it's very fitting, again, not only that Lazarus is being brought back to life is kind of the climax of these seven, but it's also then pointing us to the eighth, Jesus' own resurrection, a kind of foreshadowing of that in some ways. And so it's a momentous moment, a momentous moment. It's a momentous occasion in the Gospel of John, pointing us towards uh, Jesus' own resurrection as the climax of the Gospel. But there's a sort of funny thing here, because there's a certain way in which Lazarus' being brought back to life is also pointing us to Jesus' death. And this, I've put this box here, the reason for Jesus' death, in the same color as the foreshadowing of Jesus' death at the beginning of the passage, because I want to see these as sort of bookends to the story. That on either side of this story about resurrection life are reminders of Jesus' death. At the beginning of the story, it is Mary anointing Jesus in preparation for his burial. And now, and so these verses are technically after the lectionary reading for this week, so you may or may not read them in your gathering this Sunday. Uh, but I think it's important to keep reading to really understand how this story functions, because immediately after Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, the very next thing that we hear is that the chief priests and the Pharisees are starting to plot Jesus' death. So then the chief priests and Pharisees called together the council and said, "What are we going to do? This man is doing many miraculous signs." We just heard about those seven miraculous signs. "If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him. Then the Romans will come and take away both our temple and our people." One of them, Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year, told them, "You don't know anything. You don't see that it is better for you that one man die for the people rather than the whole nation be destroyed?" He didn't say this on his own. As the high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would soon die for the nation. And not only for the nation, Jesus would also die so that God's children scattered everywhere would be gathered together as one. From that day on, they plotted to kill him. So in the Gospel of John, the chief priests and Pharisees begin to plot to kill Jesus because of Jesus' bringing Lazarus out of the tomb. I want to emphasize that this is in the Gospel of John that this is the case. The reason is a little bit different in each of the Gospels. The timing of this sort of turn is similar in each of the Gospels. It tends to be around the time of Jesus' final Passover in Jerusalem. Well, in John, it's his final Passover. In the Synoptics, he only goes to Jerusalem for the one Passover. In John, he goes for three Passovers. But in any case, it is this turn happens as the Passover is approaching, and of course that will ultimately lead us into what we call Holy Week, Jesus' final week before his death on the cross. Um, so the timing is similar in each of the Gospels, but in the Synoptics, the reason tends the sort of final clinching reason. I mean, there's different elements along the way of Jesus's opposition with the religious leaders, but the sort of final clinching reason in Matthew, Mark, and Luke tends to be around what Jesus does in the temple, right? That he comes into the temple after the triumphal entry, and whether it's because of his teaching in the temple or because of his turning over the tables in the temple, that tends to be the reason in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But in John, John tells us right here that it's out of fear that, wow, Jesus is performing these miraculous signs and everybody's going to start believing him. And if everybody starts believing him, then the Romans will come and take away our temple and our people, and we don't want that to happen. And so they begin to plot to kill him. Uh, but also there's the sort of ironic statement, ironically prophetic, maybe we could call it, statement by Caiaphas, that he's suggesting it's better that one man die, meaning they sort of sacrifice Jesus for the peace, essentially, to keep the peace. But John says he doesn't realize what he was saying, that actually Jesus was going to die, not only for the nation, but for everyone. So there is a sense here in which this story about resurrection life is bookended by a foreshadowing and of Jesus' death on either end of the story. There is a certain sense in which you might come to this story uh, and say, "Hey, wouldn't this story sort of belong in the Easter season? I mean, after all, it's a story about resurrection life, and of course, you could use it in the Easter season, right?" Uh, there is a sense in which it could belong there, but we might go, "So why is it here in the fifth Sunday of Lent? I mean, why isn't this an Easter story?" But I think the bookends of the story point us to why it actually is appropriate for the fifth Sunday of Lent, because there is a sense in which Jesus' resurrection cannot be unbound from his crucifixion. Uh, and I put over here as sort of a preaching or teaching point for this fifth Sunday in Lent the idea that the Christian life is lived between resurrection and crucifixion. And I put the words in that order on purpose, right? Because I think we'll often talk about, uh, the Christian life is lived between crucifixion and resurrection, right? That we live between the death of this old world, awaiting the new resurrection life of the new creation. And that's right as well, right? That's absolutely right. But I think this story in John is actually making just a slightly different point. And that is that Christian life is lived not just between crucifixion and resurrection, but between resurrection and crucifixion. That is, that in the story, we hear of Jesus' resurrection power to raise Lazarus, and yet the story is pointing us towards Jesus' death on both ends of the story. That in fact, Jesus' active resurrection life for Lazarus is what is leading to his death in the Gospel of John. So it's sort of between resurrection and crucifixion in the narrative. But then I think there's also a sense in which it's the Johannine community, the community for whom this gospel is originally written, is sort of living between resurrection and crucifixion, in the sense that the Johannine community has presumably already experienced Jesus' resurrection power, right? That's the whole reason that they believe in him. But this sort of irony, in a way, is that that resurrection power has actually made them outsiders, right? That we talked about in the video in chapter 9, that they're they're being kicked out of the synagogue or have been kicked out of the synagogue, or however exactly that's working out. Their experience of Jesus' resurrection power is actually putting them at odds with those that they had previously been in relationship with. And so there is some sense in which Jesus' resurrection power is leading to a kind of death for them, right? That it's making them outsiders. And so they too are living their life between resurrection and crucifixion. And we might even go so far as to say it's lived between resurrection and crucifixion and resurrection again, right? Because you're still, but there's this tension that a lot of New Testament writers draw us to, that to be included with Jesus is going to be excluded in other ways, right? And I think that's part of what the Johannine community is experiencing. And so you can imagine this story being really powerful for them, that John is in effect saying to them, look, I know we're experiencing this marginalization, this being thrown out of the synagogue, but it's actually because of the resurrection power of Jesus that is at work within us. It's not because the resurrection power of Jesus has abandoned us, right? But look, even in Jesus' own story, his resurrection power led to his exclusion. And of course, Lazarus himself in the story, I almost forgot to mention that. Another way that this that I mentioned at the beginning, that chapters 11 and 12 of John are tied closely together, part of it is because of what I already talked about with Mary anointing Jesus and preparing him for burial, and that being foreshadowed in this story. But we also find out in chapter 12 that the religious leaders plot to kill Lazarus again, because just like they're plotting to kill Jesus, because his resurrection is creating such problems for them from John's telling. And so there's a sense in which the same thing is happening to Lazarus, right? So uh, you can really see the Johannine community, how this story would be an encouragement to them, that they can find themselves in the place of Lazarus or in the place of Jesus, however you want to put it, that Jesus' resurrection power is at work in them, and it shouldn't be a surprise when that resurrection power actually causes you to be marginalized in certain ways, because that's exactly what happened to Jesus, and that's what happened to Lazarus. And I think similarly, I think that is where this story of resurrection life can become a, a call for us in this fifth Sunday of Lent, a challenge for us in this fifth Sunday of Lent when we're thinking about Jesus' suffering and death, to be reminded that also our own experience of Jesus' resurrection life compels us towards the cross, right? That it's not just that we're on this journey with Jesus towards the cross and then hey, yay, we're going to be rescued by the resurrection. Like, yes, that's true. That's an important truth of the gospel. But there is a sense in which it works the other direction around too, right? That even Jesus' resurrection power at work in us compels us back towards the cross, right? It that you cannot separate the two. That it compels us to all, that even Jesus' resurrection doesn't erase the cross, right? It always points us back towards it to say this is the gospel, this is who Jesus is, that Jesus' path, as we heard in the very first week of Lent in Matthew 4 with the temptation in the wilderness, right? That Jesus' path to the kingdom has to go through the cross, that the cross is its fundamental shape. And I think in some ways this story is reminding us of the same thing in a very, very different way. To say that, yes, we have the story of resurrection life, but in this fifth Sunday of Lent, it's a reminder that the resurrection life of Jesus actually compels us along the journey of the cross through this season of Lent. It's not that, hey, we've experienced Easter and now we never celebrate Lent again, right? It's actually appropriate for us to go through the season of Lent year after year after year, to be reminded that it's always part of the Christian life to walk with Jesus towards the cross, to go towards those who are marginalized, to give of ourselves for the sake of others, to give up power to benefit others in the same way that Jesus did. That it's that message of the cross that Paul says is foolishness is not just a path to a greater reward. It, in some sense, is the reward. It is the path. It is the very path that Jesus calls us to. And so I think this story of Jesus bringing Lazarus back to life is a great reminder for us that the Christian life is always lived between resurrection and crucifixion.